In the bustling area of the old town's east side, there is a pedestrian street. At the very end of Yuhua Alley, on the north side of the road, stands a cafe called Old Days. Although the sign is inconspicuous and the location hidden deep within the alley, business has always been good. The cafe is never short of visitors, with patrons coming and going regularly. The cafe is decorated to resemble an old train station, with a large steam locomotive chimney on the roof. Every evening at sunset, a crisp whistle echoes and steam puffs out of the chimney. In front of the cafe, there is a spacious open area surrounded by a row of lush golden bamboo. Neatly arranged in this area are more than a dozen black umbrella tables. Each table has a vintage coin-operated gramophone beside it. With the drop of a 1 yuan coin, a low-pitched old song will play randomly. On pleasant days, the seats under the umbrellas are always filled. Old Days has a unique charm. Anyone who steps into its courtyard immediately feels a calmness of mind, a peacefulness of spirit, as if they have escaped the hustle and bustle of the world. Forgotten beautiful memories begin to resurface, one by one. The longer one stays, the clearer these distant memories become. As a result, many guests linger for an entire day, unwilling to leave until they are completely satisfied. Over time, the regulars have become fascinated by the cafe's mysterious allure and, by extension, curious about its owner. But oddly enough, no one has ever seen the owner. Eventually, a rumor began to circulate that the owner was once a Feng Shui master from Qiao Street. It was said that several years ago, he had inadvertently caused a death while practicing his craft, resulting in the loss of his credentials. He had since retired to this place in seclusion. It was afternoon. A strikingly handsome man was seated under an umbrella by a gramophone in the southeast corner of the courtyard. He was tall and slender, with porcelain white skin and eyes that sparkled like stars, full of vitality. The man wore a tailored ivory white linen shirt, styled in a vintage fashion, paired with black straight-leg ripped jeans. The combination, though seemingly at odds, somehow looked perfectly harmonious on him. He tilted his head back slightly, closing his eyes as if savoring the warm afternoon sun. The attendant noticed him and hurriedly set down his work, running over with a bow. "Mr. Bao, would you like the usual double shot of mocha with extra chocolate syrup?" The attendant's tone was extremely respectful. The man lazily gestured to the gramophone beside him and said softly, "The usual, but I'm out of change. Could you insert a coin for me?" The attendant nodded eagerly and began searching his pockets. After a moment, he apologized with a smile. "Please wait a moment, I'll grab some from the counter." At that moment, a sharp cat's meow came from under the table. The attendant was startled and looked down, only to see a beautiful tabby cat lying quietly by the man's shoes, gently placing its paw on his shoe. The attendant smiled and said, "Ah, look here," as he bent down to pick up a 1 yuan coin from the man's shoe. "Huh. It seems the cat noticed it first. It's as if it understands human speech." The attendant casually inserted the coin into the gramophone and left with a smile. The young man glanced down at the cat under the table. The tabby cat was sitting quietly by his feet, looking up at him with eyes that gleamed with an unusual light. As the gramophone began playing a melancholic old song, the young man straightened up, expressionless, and murmured, "You've got some nerve, wandering between the realms of the living and the dead in broad daylight." The tabby cat gazed up at him and suddenly spoke in a soft, feminine voice. "Mr. Bao Junzhi, I have something to ask of you." Bao Junzhi did not look at it but replied softly, How do you know my name?" The tabby cat tilted its head and raised a paw. "With your renowned name and heavenly skills, it would be hard not to know." "Is that so?" Bao Junzhi looked at it. "You sure know how to flatter." "Please help me. I need to find someone," the tabby cat repeated. "His name is Clay Buddha." With my renowned name and heavenly skills, Bao Junzhi mimicked the cat's tone indifferently. "I don't just meddle in other people's business. There are plenty on Qiao Street who can do this. Why don't you go look around there?" "I can't go to Qiao Street. My matter can only be handled by you," the tabby cat said, staring intently at Bao Junzhi. After a while, seeing no response from Bao Junzhi, the tabby cat became anxious. Its round eyes darted back and forth before it suddenly spoke in a deep voice. "Mr. Bao, have you forgotten? You've already accepted my payment. The coin that the attendant took was placed on your shoe by me. You wouldn't break your own rules, would you?" Bao Junzhi chuckled softly, as if he had heard something amusing. He looked at the tabby cat and said, "Do you know what happened to those who tried to deceive me in the past?" The tabby cat hesitated for a moment, its gaze faltering slightly, but then it quickly met his eyes again. "I don't know. I only know that you are a man of honor, someone who always keeps his word. Once you've accepted payment, no matter how big the matter is, you'll see it through to the end." Bao Junji's face remained expressionless. After a moment, he asked, "Why can't you go to Qiao Street?" Hearing this question, the tabby cat suddenly became emotional. It knelt on the ground with its front paws, tears streaming from its eyes. "Please help me. If my grievance weren't so great, I wouldn't risk being destroyed and unable to reincarnate to come here and offend you. The reason I haven't been able to seek justice is that a Feng Shui master on Qiao Street is interfering. His skills are formidable. If you don't help me, I'll be doomed to wander this world as a vengeful spirit." By the end of its plea, the tabby cat was sobbing uncontrollably. The little cat cried for a while, but seeing that Bao Junzhi remained unmoved, it sighed in frustration. Letting out a sharp cry, it said angrily, "So the rumors were all false. I thought you were a man of conscience, which is why I went through so much trouble to find the goblin lamp and consume it to come see you. But it turns out you're all the same, willing to do anything for money, no matter how heartless." At this, Bao Junzhi looked up and sighed, "I'm just waiting for you to tell me the full story. If you won't speak, fine, but why insult me?" The tabby cat froze for a moment, then suddenly stood up, its furry body trembling slightly. Bao Junzhi smiled faintly. "As you said, I've already accepted your payment." The tabby cat, overwhelmed with mixed emotions, began to sob again. Frowning, Bao Junzhi bent down, picked up the cat, and placed it on the table, saying, "Stop crying. Time is short. You haven't consumed enough goblin lamps, so their effect will only last 3 days. Now tell me, who exactly is this clay Buddha?" The tabby cat sat on the table, sniffling and looking confused. "I don't know. The last thing I heard him say in the human world was that he is clay Buddha." For the next hour, many passers-by were surprised to see a young man sitting under an umbrella in the corner of the courtyard, seriously conversing with a small cat. In the city center, near the second ring road, there is a pure steel-structured skyscraper. The floor-to-ceiling windows in every room are crafted into complex polygonal shapes. When night falls, this building becomes extremely prominent, surrounded by constantly changing colored lights. The many facets of the windows reflect the night sky, making the building look like it's adorned with countless giant diamonds, dazzling and eye-catching. There probably isn't a single businessman in this city who doesn't want an office in this building, but most are deterred by the steep rent. On the 25th floor, in the best location, there is a company specializing in import and export trade. The owner's name is Fu. In his 30s, he is known for his high profile, arrogant demeanor, and extravagant lifestyle. At this moment, Fu was sitting on an Italian embossed leather sofa by the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping champagne with a worried expression. Sitting across from him was a Feng Shui master from Qiao Street named Bao Junzhi. Fu sighed. "I've been feeling uneasy these past few days, having nightmares night after night. I keep dreaming of the scene from 6 months ago. This kind of restless feeling, is it possible that the female ghost is making another move?" In front of Bao Junzhi was a large redwood 8 immortals table, covered with various dishes. He was in the middle of stuffing a large piece of foie gras and caviar into his mouth, wearing a slightly intoxicated expression. Hearing Fu's words, he quickly chewed and swallowed, saying, "Don't worry. I've cast a spell on the bloodstain she left in your car. That little girl has now become a wandering ghost, her soul growing weaker by the day. In a little while, the mere force of the moon's and the sun's light will erase her completely. Moreover, he said, grabbing a napkin from the table to wipe his hands and mouth, before standing up and taking an apple-sized glass lamp from a walnut bookshelf beside Fu. To be absolutely sure, I've also applied this rare, enchanted smoke powder. If that little ghost tries to find her way here, all she'll see is a blur. Fu still looked uneasy and said, Master, I'm not sure about whether it's rare or not. Let's put the little ghost aside for now. What worries me is, what if someone from Qiao Street finds out about this and breaks your spell? What then? Gui Chunha laughed heartily. Mr. Chen, you're worrying too much. Not to boast, but when my master taught me, he said that the most ingenious thing about this enchanted smoke powder is that it can only be cast and never undone. First of all, it's a secret spell passed down in my sect, and very few in the trade know about it. Moreover, the talisman's core is made from the tail feathers of a pair of male and female long-wing redbeard moths, born from the same nest. These moths live deep underground and are extremely difficult to find. And to obtain a pair from the same brood is even more challenging. If it weren't for the severity of your situation, I wouldn't have taken out this treasure from my private collection. After hearing this, Fu seemed slightly reassured and even smiled a bit. So, even your master can't break it? Gui Chunha nodded emphatically. Indeed. My master once said that there's only one person in the world who could break this enchanted smoke powder. But rest assured, this person is impossible to find. Fu, who had just relaxed, tensed up again upon hearing this. Who is this person? Gui Chunha frowned and replied, He's a young man named Bao Junzhi. Not long ago, at my master's 60th birthday, Bao Junzhi came to offer his congratulations. All the prominent figures from Qiao Street were invited, yet my master showed no hesitation and immediately gave him the seat of honor. I remember that time, this youngster even patted my master on the shoulder and called him Xiao. My master is the fifth among his brothers, and seeing that Bao Junzhi looked no older than 20, I was quite shocked. But my master, looking both respectful and fearful, kept nodding and agreeing. Not to hide anything from you, Mr. Chen, I wasn't born on Qiao Street and only joined my master 2 years ago, so I don't know much about the people within the sect. But later, I found it so strange that I asked a senior disciple who had been with my master the longest. Only then did I learn that this youngster is also a disciple of the Ziwei Hall. Though he appears young, no one knows his real age. Anyway, his status is very high, and he's had some extraordinary experiences. But when I pressed further, my senior clammed up and wouldn't reveal anything more. Fu was completely drawn in, and with great interest, he asked, What kind of extraordinary experiences could someone so young have had? Gui Chunha pursed his lips. These are just some sensational stories I picked up later. If you're interested, I can tell you about them another time. But this guy is truly a legend in the Feng Shui world, with unparalleled talent and countless adventures. Who knows how many secret spells he's mastered. But he never acts lightly unless you can get him to accept your payment. This man is unpredictable and has no fixed abode, always wandering. He seeks out others, but no one can find him. Fu nodded thoughtfully and exchanged a smile with Gui Chunha. The two then sat down at the table and began to drink together. Gui Chunha, an opportunist, took a great risk in helping Fu this time, hoping to make him a powerful ally. He already had ambitions of forming a close connection. Taking advantage of the alcohol, he began to boast about his recent accomplishments. Having heard the previous conversation, Fu was now much more relaxed and frequently praised Gui Chunha, and the two became increasingly pleased with each other. Neither of them noticed that the enchanted smoke in the glass lamp began to dissipate gradually. A few minutes later, the mist inside the glass lamp completely dispersed, leaving it clear and transparent. A blood-red tire mark suddenly appeared on the clay base inside. Gui Chunha was in the middle of his story when he glanced back and saw the sight. The wine in his mouth sprayed out in shock. He rushed over to examine it closely, muttering to himself in disbelief. Impossible. How can this be? Could it be that the little ghost really found him? Just then, a voice with a hint of mockery came from the door. Yes, it's just that unlucky. The two men in the room exchanged looks, and Gui Chuanha's face suddenly turned pale. The sound of clear, strong footsteps approached the door, and then with a bang, the locked door was forced open by a powerful force. A man with piercing eyes and a handsome face stood at the door, calmly looking at them. As soon as Gui Chuanha saw the man's face, he was stunned, unable to utter a word. Bao Junzhi glanced at him and suddenly his expression turned cold. "You are Sha Wu's disciple." This casual remark sent shivers down Gui Chuanha's spine, causing him to tremble slightly, and sweat started dripping from his face. Chen Fu, not understanding the situation, stepped forward to question them, but Bao Junzhi pushed him aside. Just as he was about to protest, he turned and saw the fear on Gui Chuanha's face. He suddenly recalled the person they had just been discussing, and his heart tightened in fear as he covered his mouth with his hand. Bao Junzhi entered the room, sat in a leather chair as if no one else was there, spun around, and pointed at Gui Chuanha, saying, "Recite the precepts for me." Gui Chuanha, who was in his 40s, didn't dare to disobey the young Bao Junzhi. He immediately began to recite in a low voice. First, do not assist those with sinister motives. Second, do not aid those who value wealth over righteousness. Third, do not help those who engage in debauchery and plunder. Fourth, do not aid those who harm or kill others. Bao Junzhi looked at him sternly and said, "Since you remember, it's not Sha Wu's failure in teaching you." Gui Chuanha raised his head and met Bao Junzhi's gaze, only to feel as though he was being struck by lightning, unable to look him in the eye. Fear gripped his heart, and he stammered, "My master has always been very strict in his teachings. I have violated the rules privately since I became a disciple, and he knows nothing of it. I will return to Canyu Street immediately to receive punishment from my master." As he spoke, he glanced at Bao Junzhi out of the corner of his eye, slowly edging towards the door as if walking on thin ice, his demeanor completely different from the imposing manner he had earlier. Bao Junzhi watched him pass by with an expressionless face, then suddenly moved like the wind and tapped Gui Chuanha lightly on the forehead. Though the tap seemed gentle, Gui Chuanha cried out in pain, collapsing to the ground. When he looked up, there was a faint blood mark on his forehead, and his face was filled with fear. Bao Junzhi, though appearing calm, radiated an intimidating presence. Someone as crooked as you is not suited to possess the heavenly eye. Go back to Ziwei Hall and confess to your master what you've done, then go to the Wuyue 7 Stars Hall for punishment. This is your only warning. Gui Chuanha's face twitched at these words. He dared not argue, covering his forehead as he scrambled to his feet and fled through the door. "Master, Ma." Chen Fu hurried to the door, but there was no trace of Gui Chuanha outside. "He dares to call himself a master? What do you know?" Bao Junzhi said with a faint smile, looking at Chen Fu. "I prefer straightforward talk. Do you worship clay idols?" "What clay idols?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Chen Fu replied, looking confused. Then, in a fit of anger, he shouted, "This is my private place. You barged in, hurt my guest, and now you're saying all this nonsense. What do you want?" "Nonsense, is it?" Bao Junzhi pointed back at the tire mark under the glass cover on the counter and asked with a cold smile, "What's that for?" Chen Fu looked embarrassed and was momentarily speechless. Seeing a projector in the room, Bao Junzhi stood up and, without explanation, grabbed Chen Fu's hand and pressed it against the projector. What are you trying to do?" Chen Fu exclaimed in shock. Bao Junzhi raised an eyebrow and said, "Let's play a little game and see what you did that night 6 months ago." Chen Fu, frightened out of his wits, struggled with all his might, but Bao Junzhi's grip felt like iron, impossible to break free from. Furious and terrified, he found his entire body weakened and helpless. Just then, the projector, which was not plugged in, suddenly started up on its own, casting a clear image onto the screen opposite. At first, there were some chaotic, fast-moving figures and buildings, accompanied by the sound of static. Then the image suddenly froze, showing the front of a hotel. A heavily intoxicated Chen Fu stumbled out of the lobby towards a black SUV, struggling to insert the key into the lock before the vehicle roared out of the parking lot. The image flickered and then cleared up again, showing a teenage girl, about 17 or 18 years old, standing at a crosswalk. She had a delicate face, her youthful features still innocent, and she smiled sweetly as she occasionally glanced down at the cake box in her arms. When the pedestrian light turned green, the girl stepped onto the crosswalk. Suddenly, a black SUV, speeding through the night, raced towards her without any sign of braking, heading straight for the unsuspecting girl. The scene was heart-stopping as the headlights blazed down on her. The girl instinctively raised her slender arm to shield herself. With a loud crash, the girl was sent flying like a leaf, landing in the middle of the road several meters away. The car screeched to a halt with the sound of grinding brakes, followed by an eerie silence. After a while, a still-shaken Qiao jumped out of his car and ran toward the girl. The girl was lying on her back, pale, with blood continuously pouring out of her mouth. Seeing someone approaching, she reached out weakly and said, "Take me to the hospital." Her eyes were filled with pleading. "Save me." Qiao stood there, hunched over, staring dazedly. He looked at the blood-covered arms shaking in front of him but remained motionless, like a statue. He didn't know how long had passed when he suddenly seemed to wake up. He looked around cautiously and then ran to the intersection to check for any cameras. After picking up the crushed cake box, he quickly lifted the severely injured girl, rushed back to his car, and placed both the girl and the cake in the back seat. The SUV made a sharp U-turn and sped away into the dark night. After another flicker on the screen, the black SUV stopped in a remote, desolate area. Qiao lifted the girl out of the car and struggled through waist-high weeds. The girl was still somewhat conscious at this point. She looked around and, seeing the desolation and lack of people, immediately realized what was about to happen. Her face filled with terror, and she suddenly began to cry. "No, please don't," she pleaded, struggling as tears streamed down her face. "I don't need you to take responsibility. Just don't leave me here. I just got into my first choice university. My grandmother is at home with no one to care for her." The girl couldn't hold back her sobs. "Please, today is my 18th birthday. Don't need me to take responsibility. I can't trust you. I'm sorry, but I'm like a clay idol crossing the river. I can barely save myself." Qiao listened to the girl's heart-wrenching cries, but remained expressionless as he carried her deeper into the weeds. At this point, the girl, too agitated, passed out. Just before losing consciousness, she heard only the first part of Qiao's sentence. "I'm sorry, but I'm like a clay idol." Qiao stared at the screen in shock. After a long time, he shook off Bao Junzhi's hand in a fit of rage, hysterically picked up the projector, and smashed it to the ground. Bao Junzhi looked at him with disdain. "So that's what happened. Years ago, you drove drunk and hit a girl. Instead of helping her, you tried to escape responsibility by taking her to the wilderness and abandoning her, leading to her bleeding out and dying, undiscovered. Afterward, you were so afraid of her vengeful spirit that you had a Feng Shui master cover the tire tracks with talisman ashes so the spirit couldn't track you down." Qiao walked back to the desk with a blank expression, took out a Cuban cigar from the drawer, lit it, and took a deep puff. His face gradually calmed down. "So what? All the physical evidence and witnesses are gone. What do I have to fear? What can you, just a Feng Shui master, do to me? Who would believe you if you said anything? The courts wouldn't trust evidence like this, which seems like magic tricks." The more he spoke, the more justified he felt. "I know you have a reputation for knowing some strange and mysterious arts, but I also know that you Feng Shui masters from Qiao Street are forbidden from using magic to harm ordinary people. It's a top taboo." He laughed smugly and suddenly pressed a button to summon people. Moments later, 5 or 6 tall security guards, each holding an electric baton, rushed in and stared at Bao Junzhi menacingly. Qiao arrogantly looked at him. "You know, that girl's family is very poor. Now there's just an illiterate grandmother living on welfare. How could she afford a top-tier Feng Shui master like you? Sticking up for someone like that is hardly worth your while. I think you've been deceived because you're too young. When you look for clients in the future, you should look for people like me." Bao Junzhi looked at him indifferently and coldly said, "You are indeed cunning, always on guard and stone-hearted. You knew the girl's grandmother lived on welfare, yet you didn't offer any help, showing no remorse." Chen Fu chuckled. "Young man, you should know that's just how the world works. People flock to profit and scatter for it." Bao Junzhi looked at him for a moment, then suddenly smiled and said, "You're right. Sticking up for a client who can't protect themselves does seem like a losing deal. But if..." His tone softened and he smiled as he continued, "If I worked for you, how much would you be willing to pay?" Chen Fu was taken aback, utterly surprised by the sudden twist. He quickly changed his demeanor and said, "Really? If you're willing to help me, name your price." As if afraid Bao Junzhi might change his mind, Chen Fu quickly took out his checkbook, tore off a check, signed his name, and handed it to Bao Junzhi, saying, "I even paid Master Lian Gui 6 figures, and for someone like you, I won't bargain at all. Whenever you're ready to help, just fill in the amount, and I'll cash it immediately." Bao Junzhi took the check and glanced at it casually. "Mr. Chen, you're indeed generous. This makes me a bit embarrassed. So, besides dropping this matter, what else would you like me to do?" Hearing this, Chen Fu was overjoyed. He hadn't expected this supposedly eccentric and hard-to-approach feng shui master to be so agreeable, not only resolving his greatest concern with a single sentence, but also offering to help him with other matters. He was delighted. It seemed that no one in this world was truly above the lure of money. Smiling broadly, he dismissed the security guards, closed the door, and walked over to pat Bao Junzhi on the shoulder, speaking excitedly in a low voice. "I'm not greedy. I just want you to give me 20 more years of youth, during which I can maintain my current appearance and health." Bao Junzhi deftly dodged Chen Fu's hand, smiling but saying nothing as he carefully put away the check and said, "That's not difficult, but we must observe the proper timing and conditions. Right now, your opportunity hasn't arrived, so it's not the right time for me to use my skills. Rest assured, when the time comes, I'll find you." Chen Fu was overjoyed, muttering nonsense about living Buddhas and living gods, as he respectfully escorted Bao Junzhi out the door. The next day, with his worries lifted, Chen Fu, who had been living cautiously for half a year, found the burden unbearable. Now, with the huge weight off his shoulders, he felt like a fish that had escaped the net and returned to the sea. Unable to contain himself, he eagerly contacted his drinking buddies and threw a lavish feast at a restaurant near his company. During the banquet, everyone toasted him, and Chen Fu, in high spirits and confident in his drinking capacity, accepted every drink and emptied every glass. The drinking continued from noon until night, and when they had drained 2 cases of high-proof liquor, Chen Fu suddenly felt the world spinning and a sharp pain in his head. He only had time to cry out before collapsing to the ground, unconscious. The crowd was horrified and hurriedly called an ambulance, sending Chen Fu to the best hospital in the city and summoning the best doctors to treat him. He regained consciousness after arriving at the hospital, but was completely paralyzed. The hospital conducted a thorough examination, including enhanced MRIs and color Doppler ultrasounds, leaving no test undone. The doctors diagnosed that Chen Fu had suffered a stroke due to excessive alcohol consumption, but it wasn't severe. The current symptoms of paralysis, they assured, could be fully recovered with timely treatment and rehabilitation, with no lasting effects. Chen Fu's friends and family were relieved after hearing the doctor's words. Since the hospital didn't allow overnight stays, they left after comforting him for a while. Chen Fu, too, felt a weight lifted after hearing about his condition and soon fell into a deep sleep, still under the influence of alcohol. In the middle of the night, Chen Fu suddenly woke up from a deep, dreamless sleep. Struggling to open his eyes, he vaguely saw someone standing at his bedside, illuminated by the dim bedside lamp. To his surprise, it was the mysterious feng shui master, Bao Junzhi. Bao Junzhi stood with his arms crossed, originally gazing at him leisurely. When he saw that Chen Fu had woken up, he smiled and stepped closer, saying, "Mr. Chen, congratulations. Today, your opportunity has arrived. I've accepted your money. As you wished, I will preserve your current appearance and health for 20 years. During these 20 years, I guarantee that your body will not change one bit. He patted Qinfu's stiff arm and leg, speaking sincerely. Rest assured, whatever parts of you can't move now will remain motionless and numb for these 20 years. Qinfu was both shocked and terrified, nearly fainting from anger. His entire body, including his face, was paralyzed, leaving him unable to react, but his body trembled violently, his pupils contracted rapidly, and his eyes blinked uncontrollably. The blood pressure monitor showed his pressure spiking to 210. Bao Junzhi's smile gradually faded as he gazed at Qinfu, his voice growing as cold as ice. Qinfu, not everyone in this world is driven by profit. Did you think money would save you from the consequences of your actions? He stepped closer to Qinfu, his eyes piercing and his voice loud and clear. When you had the chance to turn back, you refused. Now, your retribution is upon you. I have 1,000 solutions at my disposal, but I won't ease the troubles of a wicked man. The hospital corridor was silent. Some nurses were reviewing patient records at the station, while others prepared injection tools, unaware of the sudden flash of blinding blue light emanating from the crack under the door of the private ward. The next day, the attending doctor came to do his rounds. He noticed that Qinfu's pulse was strong, and his complexion was healthy, yet there was no improvement in his condition. Perplexed, the doctor ordered a comprehensive examination. After reviewing the results, he muttered to himself in astonishment. If you just looked at these numbers, who would believe he's a paralyzed patient? His brain waves show normal cognitive activity, and there's no physical issue anywhere in his body. By all accounts, he should be able to regain all motor functions. So why isn't he? Lying in bed, Qinfu's eyes filled with overwhelming despair and unspeakable terror. He slowly closed his eyes, and 2 heavy tears fell onto his pillow. He understood that for the next 20 years, his soul would be trapped in his lifeless body, unable to live or die. That evening, Bao Junzhi arrived at a simple, rural house on the outskirts of town. He handed a small wooden box to an elderly woman with white hair inside, speaking to her gently. Inside is the money your granddaughter left for you. She asked me to tell you not to miss her anymore. She won't be coming back. He then lightly tapped the wooden box, producing a crisp sound like the striking of a cymbal. The old woman was initially surprised, then seemed to understand something. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. Bao Junzhi exited the house, where a tabby cat was curled up on the steps, looking up at him. Squatting down, Bao Junzhi spoke softly to the cat. The task is done. Your ties in this life are now severed. It's time for you to go where you belong. The tabby cat nodded and gazed longingly at the dimly lit window. A faint green light emerged from the top of its head, flickered in the air for a few seconds, and then vanished. The cat then stood up, its eyes now devoid of any unusual glow, stretched lazily, and slowly walked away. Bao Junzhi looked up at the starry sky before heading down the road. His figure gradually disappeared into the night. It was later said that a malicious neighbor, peering through a crack in the door, saw the old woman sitting by her bed, counting money. Seizing the opportunity while she was out buying groceries, he broke into the house and found the small wooden box by her bedside. But when he opened it, it was completely empty. As he stood there in shock, a cloud of black smoke suddenly erupted from the box, enveloping his face. Terrified, he rushed home, only to discover that his entire face had turned as black as an African's, rendering him unrecognizable. The most unsettling part was that no matter what he tried, he couldn't wash it off. His face remained black for 10 full days. The experience left him so shaken that he was unable to eat or sleep properly, and from then on, he would avoid even passing by the old woman's house, never daring to entertain any further ill thoughts.